Alright guys, so today I'm going to break down the gastrointestinal tract, basic A&P, just a gross overview. So let's talk about some, I know it's a little hard to see probably, but you guys can follow along in the book, concepts all the same. So in essence we have the alimentary canal, or gastrointestinal tract, which begins in the mouth, chewing. We have the salivary glands, the parotid glands, the submandibular and the sublingual salivary glands that secrete salivary amylase, and that's where carbohydrate metabolism begins, right? So afterwards, we form the bolus in the mouth and we swallow. And the glossopharyngeal nerve, by the way, is the one that's responsible for that. So if you have a damage to the 8th cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, you have a potential issues with swallowing, a potential for aspiration. So in essence, when we swallow the bolus, the esophagus is what connects the mouth to the stomach. It propels the food downward via something called peristalsis, which is a wave-like movement that propels the food downward. We have at the beginning of the stomach something called the lower esophageal sphincter, or the cardiac sphincter, which is a valve that closes and opens and facilitates the food being pushed down into the stomach, and it prevents acid reflux when we lay flat. So that's how we won't get acid reflux disease or any type of heartburn. Inside the stomach we have acid. We have chief cells and parietal cells, and they're responsible for secreting hydrochloric acid and pepsin. And these acids help break down elements that we consume, like proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and lipids, and other sorts of things. Just help with the breaking down. I want you guys to know that inside the stomach, the pH is really low. It's very acidic, usually 4.0 or less. And keep that in mind, because as the chyme, that's what we call the mixing of food and all those gastric juices, as the chyme leaves the stomach, it passes through something called the pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter is another valve that allows the food to pass through from the stomach to the small intestine. Now real quick guys, the small intestine breaks down into three basic components. The first part is known as the duodenum. And inside the duodenum, you have all the food, all the chyme that's leaving the stomach via the pyloric sphincter, and it enters the duodenum and it starts mixing with the digestive enzymes released by the pancreas, which we'll talk about in just a bit. So remember folks, that it's DJI. I remember like, DJ, I'm pregnant. So just remember, D for duodenum, jejunum, ileum. Those are the three components of the small intestines in their descending form. So duodenum, jejunum, and then the ileum. And you guys should note that the maximum majority of the absorption of nutrients occurs in the small intestine. So as the chyme leaves the stomach into the small intestine, it passes through the duodenum, jejunum, the ileum. In the duodenum, you have a connection of the pancreas and the duodenum, and you have something called the sphincter of Oddi, or the ampulla of Vader, and in essence, that's where the digestive juices leave the pancreas and enter and mix with the chyme inside the duodenum. We have different types of digestive enzymes. The pancreas has an exocrine function right now that we're going to be discussing, and it releases amylase, protease or trypsin, and lipase. Make sure you guys know that amylase helps absorb the breakdown of carbohydrates. Protease or trypsin, same thing, helps absorb the breakdown of protein. And lipase helps with the absorption of fatty acids or lipids. And those are your digestive enzymes. The pancreas also releases a base, okay? It releases an alkaline substance to neutralize the high acidic content that's being released from the stomach. So the concept is this, folks. As the chyme leaves, it's passing through the small intestine, dictated right here by the black lines. Nutrients is being absorbed. All the elements are being absorbed into the systemic circulation. And by the time the content, first of all, actually, the content inside the small intestine is highly acidic. It's being neutralized, but while it's inside the small intestine, it's highly acidic. You need to understand that concept so you can understand what happens when you have an ileostomy. The patient's going to be at risk for skin breakdown because the acids break down or excoriate the skin, potentially. By the time it leaves the small intestine, most of the nutrients has been absorbed, but it's still very fluid-like. And it passes through what we call the Ileocecal Valve, the connection tube or the valve between the ileum and the cecum, which is the first segment of the large intestine. That fluid passes through, still in a highly fluid constituents, and it passes in through the cecum. The cecum then, with peristalsis, pushes the stool upward, the ascending colon, then the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and then finally the rectum and anus. While it's passing through the large intestine, you guys have to understand that now the stool is forming. We're creating bulk. So the water is being reabsorbed back into the system, and the acid has now been neutralized, and now we have base inside the large intestine. You need to understand that. The more fluid substances you have, or the more, or before the feces is actually expelled, we still have base in here now. So that's important because you'll get questions like, the patient has a colostomy bag. What pH imbalance are they at risk for? Well, if you understand that base is in the large intestine, and if you have a colostomy bag, you're losing base. Well, you lose base, the other one goes up, you develop metabolic acidosis. Same thing with diarrhea. If you have diarrhea, if you're expelling all the fluid with the base in it, and you're not absorbing it, well then you're gonna develop metabolic acidosis, or it comes out of your ass, acidosis, right? In essence, folks, that's how the stool passes through. But we're not done yet. We still have to discuss the accessory organs. Let's focus for a little bit on the continuation of the pancreas. The pancreas is very important because the pancreas performs two functions, both endocrine, which is hormones, and exocrine function. So let me explain both of those real quick. The pancreas has an endocrine function. It's got something called the islets of Langerhans, and that's a network of cells that produce specific hormones. And we're talking about alpha and beta cells. Your alpha cells release glucagon, which help your liver release sugar, or it helps convert something we call gluconeogenesis, meaning taking the stored form of sugar in the liver called glycogen, and it converts it into glucose, and the body can readily utilize that for cell metabolism. So the alpha cells release glucagon, the beta cells release insulin, and insulin helps with the absorption of glucose into the cell. So think of the insulin as a key. It opens up the cell, and it pushes the glucose inside for cell metabolism. So the cells can actually utilize the energy that the sugar, the glucose, provides. We also have an exocrine function carried out by the pancreas, and that's what we were discussing earlier, the digestive enzymes. Amylase breaks or helps absorb carbohydrates. Protease or trypsin helps absorb the breakdown of proteins, and the lipase helps with the absorption of fatty acids or the breakdown of the fats that we have in digestion. And it also releases the base that mixes in with the chyme so it can neutralize the acid as it's passing through the small intestine, right folks? So that concludes essentially what you guys need to know about the pancreas. We also have the liver. Now look, the liver is really important simply because the liver performs a large host of functions, and they're listed right here. So let me break each of them down real quick. The liver synthesizes bile. Normally when our liver performs its function, it breaks down the toxins or the waste products that our blood contains of a lot of metabolic processes. Within those elements, you have salts that aid in fat digestion. So that's why bile emulsifies fat. You guys think of a cup of water, you put a little oil in it, they segregate. They don't mix together. So it's not soluble in water. So what we do is the liver produces a substance known as bile, and that helps get inside the fatty substance. It breaks it down to its basic fatty acids, and then lipase helps with the absorption into the cells. The liver is also responsible for synthesizing plasma proteins. There's something called albumin, and albumin maintains something called oncotic pressure. And oncotic pressure is, in essence, the dictation of where the fluid's going to go throughout the body. And if you guys haven't watched yet, watch my small video on pimps and harlots. You'll know what I'm talking about when you watch it. The liver also aids in clotting. It stores vitamin K. It helps with clotting factors. So liver aids in the clotting cascade. So if there's something wrong with the liver, you're going to have issues with bleeding tendencies. And keep that in mind because that's the whole context. That's the context that you guys need to understand for nursing school. It also stores glycogen, like I was talking about, or the metabolism of carbohydrates, in essence, because when you consume carbohydrates, which is your body's bread and butter for nutrients, for calories, for energy, for glucose, well, what it does is it helps metabolize it. When we've met our metabolic needs in the blood system for glucose, well, our liver helps metabolize the carbohydrates. It gets the excess amount of carbohydrates that we have in the blood, and it stores them in the refrigerator in our liver as in the form of something called glycogen. And it also stores fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamins A, vitamin E, vitamin D, vitamin K, and also vitamin B12. B12 is very important. The liver also detoxifies blood to ease excretion by kidneys. So for instance, when we're breaking down protein, any type of protein that we consume, we have nitrogenous waste, we have uric acid, we have different types of ammonias. These are the byproducts of protein catabolism, of protein breakdown. Our liver gets all of those elements, and it helps break them down into more simple substances so it can send them to the kidneys, and our kidneys can excrete them. And if you guys remember the last video, I discussed creatinine. And creatinine is one of those elements for muscle expenditure, or urea and nitrogen, and that's why we look at the BUN, the blood's urea and nitrogen, that give us a pretty good idea of how well our kidneys are functioning. It also excretes bilirubin. Now, bilirubin is the substance that's released from the red blood cells when they've met their expiration period. A red blood cell has an average lifespan of about 120 days, and when they've met that maturity level, they have to be broken down. And the substance that's released is known as bilirubin. Bilirubin happens to be yellow in pigment. And so our liver is responsible for getting that bilirubin and breaking it down and turning it into something called urobilinogen. And that, folks, is what gives our stool its pigment color. So when somebody has issues, and by the way, it's released also by the bile through the liver. So when somebody has like a gallbladder obstruction or some issues with the bile not released into the small intestine, that's why the stool has like a clay white pigment to it, because the bile salts and the urobilinogen is not being excreted, so it's not giving us our stool its beautiful brown color. Okay? So it excretes bilirubin, the cholesterol, and any drug metabolites. Any substances that you consume that are drugs, our liver metabolizes them, breaks them down, and sends them to the kidney so we can excrete them. Carbohydrate metabolism, which I discussed earlier. Protein metabolism, it's responsible in the aiding of immunoglobulins, which deal with our immune system. So our liver is really important, folks. It has a whole host of capabilities. So when we have liver issues, just understand what the liver does. And if you have a liver issue, if it can't carry that process out, then that's where the deficit's going to be at. And it's also responsible for phagocytosis carried out by the Kupffer cells. And this is the detoxification of any bacterial waste that's remnant inside the blood. Our liver is responsible for excreting that or breaking it down and sending it to the kidney so we can expel it out. And that, in essence, folks, is essentially all the main components except for one thing that I've just lacked to mention, the gallbladder. Now, the gallbladder is really important because the gallbladder only stores bile. It doesn't actually create it. And when you consume food elements that contain fat, inside the duodenum, you have a hormone called cholecystokinin that's released, which tells your body that, hey, we have fat inside the GI tract. And that prompts the gallbladder to contract so it can release some of that bile. The duct that connects the gallbladder to the common bile duct, or the duct that leaves the gallbladder, is known as a cystic duct. And then the duct that goes that spreads out from the right and left hepatic ducts, that goes into the actual duodenum via the common bile duct, that's what transports the bile into the small intestine, into the duodenum, so it can mix with the fatty components and hopefully emulsify them or break them down so lipase can exert its effect and absorb those fatty acids within the GI tract. The pancreas and the gallbladder both share the common bile duct. We call it, when it leaves the pancreas, we call it the pancreatic duct. And when it leaves the gallbladder, we call it the common bile duct. But in essence, they both merge into the duodenum, and they both release, if it's the pancreas, it releases your digestive enzymes. And if it's from the gallbladder, it releases bile. And that's how it emulsifies the fat and helps and aids in digestion. And that, in essence, is digestion, folks. But I want to emphasize a couple more points. The liver has a very large vein that we call the hepatic portal vein. And that drains the entire GI tract, from the esophagus all the way down to the anus, including the spleen. And if you guys recall, the spleen is a reservoir for blood. And in case of hypovolemia, it can release up to 500 mLs of emergency blood in case we need it, so we won't develop shock so fast. This is really important because you guys need to understand this in the context of disease processes. You know, as a nurse, what do you have to know about this? Well, if somebody has liver issues, and if you understand that the hepatic portal vein drains the entire GI tract among other systems, among other parts of the body, the liver has to perform or carry out all these processes. But if you have liver cirrhosis, what happens to the pressure within the hepatic portal vein? It goes up, right? And if it goes up, you develop something called hepatic portal hypertension. That causes the fluid to escape the hepatic portal vein. And if you have liver damage, can you create those proteins that I was discussing, the albumin? You cannot. If you can't create your albumin, you can't maintain oncotic pressure. That means you can't dictate where fluid goes. And this is what contributes to ascites. Because the pressure within inside pushes the fluid out, you don't have the plasma proteins to keep the water in check, and you develop ascites. You develop hepatic portal hypertension. And because of that, the liver ends up getting big, hepatomegaly. So you have a whole course of disease processes that can develop simply because the liver is not functioning well. And in essence, folks, that is the GI tract. I hope this helped out for review. Please follow me on NCLEX.solve, tell your friends, and please follow me also on my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.